Over the weekend, President Trump's critics seized on that Stone commutation. The Lincoln Project, a group working to elect Joe Biden in November, released an ad calling the Trump administration a criminal enterprise and listing the members of the Trump team who've been convicted of felonies. Here to break down the political implications of this and more, our Politics Monday team. That's Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report and host of Public Radio's Politics with Amy Walter, and Tamara Keith of NPR. She also co-hosts the NPR Politics Monday podcast. Welcome to you both. And let's just start off with that ad. It's worth mentioning, Tam, it was on Friday that President Trump commuted the sentence of Roger Stone. On Saturday, the Lincoln Project had that ad ready to go. An ad like that, leveraging Stone's commutation, what is the messaging there, and who is that messaging going towards?
Well, the Lincoln Project has been sort of a rapid response unit, coming out with ads very quickly whenever President Trump does anything that they think deserves an ad. And some of their ads have been very trolly, like seem to be aimed at an audience of one who might be watching Fox and Friends that morning, the President of the United States. In terms of who they're trying to reach, arguably, they're trying to reach Republicans who, the last time around in 2016, may have had some discomfort with President Trump, but couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton. And now there is a push, and it's broader than the Lincoln Project. Certainly, that's just one example. Now there is a push to try to win over people who do feel uncomfortable with President Trump and his norms busting or his handling of the coronavirus. It's not clear to me, though, that the Stone commutation is going to be the thing that puts people over the edge. I mean, President Trump has, as Lisa reported, done a lot of these things, and look to how he sort of has rewarded his friends and gone after people like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and others who testified in the impeachment trial.
Amy, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I agree with Tim's point about that. If there's anything that's hurting the president politically, it's the coronavirus. The fact that if you look at the most recent polling, on average, the president's disapproval rating, feeling the crisis that we're in right now, is disapproval rating 60. The majority of Americans believe that on the most important issue facing right now, the president is not doing a good job on that. That is what's weighing this president down, much more so than what is either happening with the commutations or the continuing back and forth with the president and that he's as his political enemies and the tweet storms.
So, Amy, or Tam, rather, let me ask you about the president's pandemic response. We've seen an administration struggling to message on it consistently and coherently. And this new development, our colleague Michelle Sindor reported on earlier, of attacking the very same experts who are working with the White House task force to help them respond to the pandemic, specifically Dr. Anthony Fauci. What do you make of that messaging? And also the fact that the president was seen for the very first time wearing a mask this weekend?
Yeah, the president was seen for the very first time wearing a mask this weekend. It's been months since the recommendation was put out, and he actively avoided wearing a mask. He wore it, and then his campaign was sort of shouting from the rooftops, spiking footballs, whatever you want to call it, on Twitter, saying how manly and amazing he looked, and now he's going to win the race. It was sort of an over-the-top response from his campaign to what is a fairly standard thing that most people are doing, politicians or not. The White House, in its response and its inability to sort of land on a message, this effort to separate from Fauci or to have Dr. Fauci be less of a public face. Part of that is that when Fauci goes out and does these interviews, he often is asked questions that lead to him revealing that there is space between his view and the White House view. And White House officials I've spoken to are frustrated about that. And keep saying, like, well, he's just one of the experts, and yet Fauci has been held up as the expert. He's on socks, he's on donuts and prayer candles, he's everywhere. And the White House is sort of frustrated by that. But the bigger question is, what is their plan? What is their response? And that is much less clear. It's sort of the going forward strategy on how they're going to deal with the coronavirus. I mean, the president is doing his best not to really talk about it, and when he does talk about it, he's often downplaying it or downplaying the deaths.
Amy, some people are looking at the way the White House has been messaging recently, specifically with regard to Dr. Fauci, and saying he's trying to undermine Dr. Fauci. When you look at how people are viewing those two messengers, what do we know about how people are taking in those two sources of information?
But we do know that, at least in the most recent polling, Dr. Fauci has much higher favorable ratings than the president does. He's certainly not polarizing as the president. The other thing we know that this president loves to do is muddy the waters, and Russia investigation is a perfect example of that. There are enough stuff out there that people really start to question and doubt what it is seeing and hearing. And if they throw their hands up and say, well, I don't know, it all seems kind of like a mess, that's kind of a win for the president. The problem in muddying the water on a public health crisis is that it actually puts people's lives in danger. And there is absolutely no way for the president to get back the economy that he would like to have. Talking about how great the economy was before COVID started, he talked about how important it was to get schools back in session this fall. None of that can happen unless COVID is under control and unless people in this country feel safe doing their everyday activities. So this is, again, the president goes back to his traditional strategy of just make it somebody else's fault or make it unclear so that I don't get the blame. But in this case, when you're president of the United States in a major crisis, the buck definitely stops with you.
Tan, let me ask you about how we're already seeing some indication that the virus could help to shape in some way the presidential election. When you look at some new poll numbers out from CBS News, and you look at three key Sun Belt states, all states that have been hit very hard by the pandemic are seeing surges. In Florida, Joe Biden is now leading President Trump by 6 points. They are virtually tied in Arizona, and Biden is now competitive in Texas. When you look at those numbers and how close they are, where they are today, what do they say to you?
Well, one thing about those three states, it's that they are demographically shifting, in that they are states that are growing more diverse, and that would matter. But what matters more now also is that President Trump is doing really poorly with older voters. They have been a critical part of his base, and it's possible he can get them back. But right now, Biden is performing quite well with older voters who are certainly a presence in those states and are a significant part of why President Trump was able to perform as well as he did in 2016 in those states. And the issue with older voters is the coronavirus is affecting their lives in a very real way. I was talking to a Republican pollster who also does a lot of focus groups with women who said, grandmothers are mad. Grandmothers are livid. It's not just about, having to shelter in place or, feeling at risk from coronavirus. They can't see their grandkids. And that affects them in a very visceral way.
Amy, let me ask you about some related or possibly related Senate races, too. If you look at these battleground states and you see that President Trump could be vulnerable there, what about other incumbent senators in red states? Should they be similarly concerned?
They should be very concerned, and they are very concerned. I'm not going into 2020. Democrats, they had a little bit of an advantage on the overall playing field. They are not playing as much defense as they were, say, back in 2018. But they didn't have a lot of obvious targets. As the president's numbers sink, that means that Republicans' numbers are sinking, even in places that theoretically, at least earlier this year, looked safe for them, like Iowa. Or we put up in that state in Arizona, which is a purple state. But we're starting to see states like Montana come online. And so what this means now is if you're a Republican incumbent in a state that is at all competitive, you should be very nervous, in part because the president is not just a little bit of a drag, but he's like an anchor right now around the ankles of these incumbent Republican senators. If he doesn't see his numbers go up as we get closer to the election, it's going to be very hard for some of these senators. And Arizona is a great example of that, for the incumbent Republican senators to be able to get get enough oxygen to win these races. The other thing I'd note about, especially about Arizona and Texas, we had a preview in 2018 of why those states are more competitive. And that, as Pam pointed out, not that they're diversifying, but they're very suburban. Arizona, especially, most of the vote, more than 60% of the vote, comes from Maricopa County, which is Phoenix and its suburbs. As those suburbs are changing, and as places like Dallas and Houston, San Antonio suburbs, the Austin suburbs become more Democratic leaning, it gets tougher and tougher for Republicans to pull out the kind of margins that they're used to seeing in those kind of states.
There is a lot to track in the weeks and the months ahead. That is Amy Walter and Tamara Keith breaking it all down for us again in Politics Monday. Thanks to you both. Good to see you.
Good to see you.